Picture this. September 1942, the Detroit Arsenal tank plant in Warren, Michigan, and William Knudsen stands in front of a freshly assembled M4 Sherman medium tank, his hand resting on the welded steel hull while his mind races with doubts that won't silence themselves. Knudsen, former president of General Motors and now director of U.S. war production, has just received intelligence reports from North Africa describing how German tank crews are openly mocking American armor, calling the Sherman a Ronson lighter because it supposedly lights on first strike, dismissing its thin armor and modest 75mm gun as hopelessly inadequate against German Panthers and Tigers that mount 88mm guns and armor twice as thick. The numbers are sobering. German panzer divisions in North Africa are achieving kill ratios of 4-to-1 against early American tank deployments, and Wehrmacht officers captured at El Alamein have told interrogators that they consider American tanks a joke. Mechanically simple toys built by a nation that understands automobiles but not warfare. Knudsen has spent 2 years overseeing the transformation of American automotive production into the arsenal of democracy, converting factories that built Chevrolets and Fords into facilities producing tanks at rates the world has never seen. 50,000 Shermans will roll off assembly lines by war's end, more than any other American tank and exceeded only by the Soviet T-34 in total production. But quantity means nothing if quality is inadequate. If these machines are sending American boys into battles they can't win. If the basic design philosophy that prioritized reliability and mass production over thick armor and big guns was a catastrophic miscalculation that will cost thousands of lives. The question haunting Knudsen on that September afternoon is one that military planners and historians would debate for decades. Did America build the wrong tank, sacrificing crew protection for production efficiency? Or did we build exactly the right tank for a global war that required shipping armor across oceans, maintaining it with minimally trained mechanics, and replacing losses faster than the enemy could inflict them? By late 1942, the psychological warfare was already intense. German propaganda broadcasts featured captured American tankers describing how their Shermans burned when hit, how they watched friends die in steel coffins that couldn't stand up to German guns, how they felt abandoned by commanders who sent them into battle in inferior equipment. American tank crews were developing what military psychiatrists would later classify as anticipatory trauma, the conviction that climbing into a Sherman meant accepting a high probability of death, and morale in armored units was beginning to crack under the weight of that fatalism. But what the Germans mocking American tanks didn't know, what wouldn't become apparent until 1943 and 1944, when the full weight of American industrial power reached European battlefields, was that the Sherman's perceived weaknesses were actually strategic strengths in a war where logistics, reliability, and replacement rates mattered more than individual tank versus tank combat performance. This is the story of how American engineers built a tank that German crews laughed at, until it buried them under a tidal wave of reliable, maintainable, endlessly replaceable armor that could be crewed by farm boys with 6 weeks of training and kept running by mechanics whose only previous experience was fixing tractors. It's the story of how mass production became a weapon as decisive as any gun, how American industrial philosophy defeated German engineering perfectionism, and how the men who built and crewed the Sherman transformed perceived inadequacy into a machine that won the war, not through individual superiority, but through a relentless, unstoppable volume that German industry simply could not match. To understand the Sherman, we must first understand the world that produced it, a world where American military thinking in the 1930s was shaped by isolationism, budget constraints, and a profound lack of recent combat experience that left the U.S. Army unprepared for modern mechanized warfare. William Knudsen was born Signius Wilhelm Pohl Knudsen in Copenhagen, Denmark, in 1879, immigrating to the United States in 1900 with $20 in his pocket and dreams of working in America's booming manufacturing sector. He started as a laborer in a bicycle factory, moved to automobile production, and by 1920 had risen to become a senior executive at Ford Motor Company, where he pioneered assembly line techniques that made automobiles affordable for average Americans. Henry Ford's obsession with efficiency and standardization shaped Knudsen's entire approach to manufacturing. He believed that any product, no matter how complex, could be broken down into standardized components that semi-skilled workers could assemble at high speed using specialized machinery. When Knudsen left Ford for General Motors in 1922, He brought those principles with him and helped transform GM into the world's largest automobile manufacturer by applying mass production techniques to multiple vehicle lines simultaneously. By 1940, when President Franklin Roosevelt appointed him to lead America's rearmament effort, Knudsen had spent 40 years perfecting the art of building complex machines quickly, cheaply, and reliably, experience that proved perfectly suited to the challenge of building tanks for a global war. The cultural and technological context of the late 1930s created the conditions that would shape the Sherman's design philosophy in ways that German engineers, working from completely different assumptions, never understood until it was too late. American industry in 1940 was the most productive in human history, capable of manufacturing 25 million automobiles between 1920 and 1940, creating a workforce of millions who understood internal combustion engines, transmissions, and mechanical systems at an intuitive level that Europeans couldn't match. This civilian automotive expertise meant that American tank designers could assume their crews would include men who'd grown up fixing cars and tractors, who understood how engines worked without needing years of specialized training, and who could perform field repairs using skills they'd learned in civilian life. German tank design, by contrast, emerged from a military-industrial complex that prioritized engineering excellence and technical sophistication over ease of maintenance, producing tanks like the Tiger and Panther that were masterpieces of engineering, but nightmares for field mechanics who needed specialized tools and extensive training to keep them operational. The Sherman's design began in April 1941, when the U.S. Armored Force Board reviewed 5 prototype designs for a new medium tank to replace the M3 Grant, which was essentially a stopgap design with a sponson-mounted 75mm gun that limited its effectiveness. The simplest design, designated T6, used a modified M3 hull and chassis, but mounted the 75mm gun in a fully rotating turret, giving it the flexibility that modern tank warfare demanded. The T6 design prioritized characteristics that reflected American strategic realities. It had to be light enough to ship across oceans efficiently, simple enough to manufacture in automobile factories with minimal retooling, reliable enough to operate with limited maintenance in harsh conditions from North African deserts to European winters, and standardized enough that replacement parts could be produced by multiple manufacturers and used interchangeably across the entire fleet. The maximum armor thickness was set at 75mm on the frontal hull, adequate against most German anti-tank guns in 1941, but deliberately limited to keep weight below 35 tons so the Sherman could use existing bridges, landing craft, and transport ships without requiring new infrastructure. The decision to use a gasoline engine rather than diesel, despite diesel's lower flammability, was driven by American fuel availability and the fact that U.S. automotive industry had vast experience with gasoline engines but limited diesel expertise. Every design choice reflected a philosophy fundamentally different from German tank development. American engineers were building a weapon system for a global logistics network, while German engineers were building dueling machines for relatively short-range European combat. The prototype Sherman was completed in September 1941, 3 months before Pearl Harbor, and the Army approved it for production in October, with the first production model rolling off the assembly line at Lima Locomotive Works in February 1942. The speed of this development, from design approval to production in just 10 months, was possible only because the Sherman used so many components already proven in civilian automotive applications or in the M3 Grant predecessor. The challenges facing the Sherman and its advocates emerged almost immediately after the first combat deployments in late 1942, when the gap between American design philosophy and battlefield reality created crises of confidence that threatened to undermine the entire armored warfare program. The Sherman first saw combat with British forces at the Second Battle of El Alamein in October 1942, where it performed adequately against German Panzer IIIs and IVs, which were roughly equivalent in firepower and armor. But by early 1943, as Germany deployed heavier tanks in response to battlefield losses, the Sherman's limitations became apparent. The German Tiger Inferior, introduced in late 1942, mounted an 88mm gun and frontal armor up to 100mm thick, making it effectively immune to Sherman's 75mm gun at normal combat ranges, while capable of destroying Shermans from distances exceeding 2,000 yards. The Panther medium tank deployed in 1943 combined heavy armor with excellent mobility and a powerful 75mm gun with much higher muzzle velocity than the Sherman's version, creating a vehicle that could kill Shermans before they could effectively return fire. American tank crews quickly recognized these disadvantages and began reporting that they needed multiple Shermans to take on a single Tiger or Panther, accepting that several tanks would be destroyed in the process, the infamous 5 Shermans for 1 Tiger ratio that became part of tanker folklore and psychological burden. The psychological impact on Sherman crews was devastating and has been documented extensively in post-war interviews and memoirs that reveal the terror of fighting in a vehicle you knew was outmatched by enemy armor. Belton Cooper, an American tank maintenance officer, wrote in his memoir Death Traps about the horrifying casualties among Sherman crews, describing burned-out hulks with dead crewmen still inside and the constant smell of burning flesh and metal that permeated salvage yards where destroyed tanks were collected. Cooper's account, while criticized by some historians as overly focused on worst-case scenarios, captured the psychological reality that many tank crews faced. The knowledge that if they encountered a Tiger or Panther, their survival depended more on luck and tactics than on their vehicle's protective capabilities. This knowledge created what modern psychologists would recognize as anticipatory anxiety and learned helplessness, conditions where soldiers believe outcomes are beyond their control and develop fatalistic attitudes that can paralyze decision-making and erode unit cohesion. Tank commanders developed elaborate tactics to compensate for the Sherman's perceived inferiority, ambushing from flanks where armor was thinnest, using superior numbers to overwhelm individual German tanks, calling in artillery and air support rather than engaging in direct tank duels, and accepting that their role was often to fix enemy tanks in place so that tank destroyers or artillery could kill them rather than attempting direct engagements. But what these tactical adaptations obscured, and what German commanders failed to fully appreciate until it was too late, was that the Sherman's design priorities were perfectly suited to the strategic realities of a global war where industrial capacity mattered more than individual combat superiority. The most important statistic about the Sherman wasn't its armor thickness or gun penetration. It was the production total, 49,324 units, built between February 1942 and July 1945. An average of 13,000 per year, or 36 per day at peak production. This volume was possible only because the Sherman used standardized components that could be manufactured by multiple contractors simultaneously. 11 different companies produced Sherman variants, from locomotive works to car factories to steel fabricators, all building to the same specifications so that parts were interchangeable across the entire fleet. A Sherman destroyed in Normandy could be replaced within days by a new tank shipped from Detroit, crewed by replacements trained in Texas, and operational within hours of reaching the front, because its mechanical systems were simple enough that crews with minimal training could operate and maintain them. German tanks, by contrast, were manufactured at far lower rates. Only 1,347 Tigers and about 6,000 Panthers produced during the entire war, and required specialist crews and mechanics whose training took months or years, making each loss difficult to replace and creating a situation where battlefield attrition couldn't be sustained. The Sherman's reliability proved to be a weapon as important as its gun, a characteristic that became apparent during the breakout from Normandy in summer 1944, when American armored divisions advanced hundreds of miles in weeks, and German Panther units broke down at rates approaching 50%. Due to transmission failures and engine problems that required factory-level repairs. General George Patton's Third Army, equipped almost entirely with Shermans, raced across France in August 1944, covering distances that German planners had thought impossible for mechanized forces, not because Shermans were faster than Panthers, they weren't, but because they could maintain that speed day after day without breaking down, could be repaired in the field by crews using basic tools, and could be refueled and rearmed from a logistics system that worked because it was designed around standardized components and procedures. A Sherman's engine, transmission, and suspension could be replaced in a forward maintenance depot in hours, using components that fit any Sherman variant, while a broken Panther often required evacuation to Germany for repairs that took weeks or months. This reliability advantage compounded over time. By late 1944, American armored divisions could sustain operational tempos that German units simply couldn't match because their tanks were either destroyed, broken down, or trapped behind Allied lines without fuel or spare parts. The turning point in the Sherman's reputation came not from a single battle, but from the cumulative effect of hundreds of engagements where American tactical doctrine, industrial capacity, and crew determination overcame individual technical disadvantages. The Battle of Aricourt in September 1944 provides perhaps the clearest example of how the Sherman won despite apparent inferiority. German 5th Panzer Army, equipped with over 200 Panthers, attacked the U.S. 4th Armored Division near the French town of Aricourt, confident that their superior tanks would overwhelm American armor and halt Patton's advance. The ensuing battle lasted 2 weeks and resulted in the destruction of over 100 German tanks, mostly Panthers, against American losses of about 30 Shermans, a kill ratio that contradicted every assumption about relative combat effectiveness. How did supposedly inferior Shermans achieve this result? The answer lies in factors that German planners had dismissed as secondary. American crews had superior optics and radio communications, allowing them to spot German tanks first and coordinate attacks effectively. American logistics kept Shermans fueled and supplied even during rapid advances, while German tanks ran out of fuel and became easy targets. American air superiority meant that German tanks moving in daylight were vulnerable to ground attack aircraft, forcing them into defensive positions that negated their range advantages, and American numerical superiority meant that even when individual Shermans were destroyed, there were always more to continue the fight, while German losses couldn't be replaced. The psychological transformation among American tank crews during 1944 and 1945 reflected their growing understanding that wars aren't won by individual weapons, but by systems, by the integration of firepower, mobility, logistics, air power, and industrial capacity into a whole that exceeded the sum of its parts. Sergeant Lafayette Poole, one of the most successful American tank commanders with over 1,000 confirmed enemy vehicle kills, described his approach in terms that had nothing to do with technical superiority. We didn't try to slug it out with Panthers. We used speed, we used surprise, we used the fact that there were always more of us, and we used our radios to coordinate attacks that German crews couldn't match because their communications were worse. My tank got knocked out 3 times, and each time I was back in action within a day because there was always another Sherman available. This acceptance that individual tanks were expendable, but the crew's expertise and determination mattered more, was psychologically liberating because it shifted focus from the machine's limitations to the crew's agency, from fatalistic acceptance of vulnerability to active exploitation of advantages that German crews lacked. The Sherman's shortcomings, its relatively thin armor and modest gun, were real and cost lives, but they were the price paid for characteristics that mattered more in a global war: reliability that allowed sustained operations, simplicity that allowed minimally trained crews to fight effectively, and mass production that allowed losses to be replaced faster than the enemy could inflict them. The resolution and legacy of the Sherman story extends far beyond its combat record to encompass broader questions about industrial philosophy, military doctrine, and the relationship between technological sophistication and strategic effectiveness. By the time Germany surrendered in May 1945, Shermans had fought on every front where American forces deployed, from the Aleutian Islands to North Africa to the Pacific Islands to Western Europe, demonstrating versatility that more specialized vehicles couldn't match. The British used Shermans in Burma and Italy. The Soviets received thousands under Lend-Lease. The Free French equipped entire armored divisions with them, and even the Chinese used them against Japanese forces. This global deployment was possible only because the Sherman's design prioritized characteristics: moderate weight, reliable mechanics, adaptable platform, that allowed it to function in climates and terrains ranging from Arctic cold to tropical jungles to desert heat. Post-war analysis revealed that the Sherman's combat loss rates, while higher than ideal, were considerably better than wartime propaganda suggested. Modern historians estimate that roughly 30,000 Shermans were lost to all causes during the war: combat losses, mechanical failures, accidents. Out of nearly 50,000 produced, a loss rate of about 60% that was actually comparable to or better than German tank loss rates when adjusted for the vastly different operational conditions and employment patterns. The debate over whether the Sherman was a good tank or a death trap continues among historians and tank enthusiasts, but this debate often misses the fundamental point. The Sherman was exactly the tank that American strategic circumstances required and it won the war not by being the best individual fighting vehicle, but by being the best system for projecting American industrial power onto European and Pacific battlefields. German engineering produced technically superior tanks. The Tiger's armor and gun were undeniably better than the Sherman's, but German industry couldn't produce those tanks in numbers sufficient to affect strategic outcomes, couldn't supply them reliably in the field, and couldn't replace them when they were destroyed or broke down. The Sherman represented a different philosophy entirely: good enough to fight effectively when properly employed, simple enough to manufacture in vast numbers, reliable enough to sustain operational tempo, and cheap enough that losses, while tragic for the crews involved, didn't threaten strategic objectives because replacement was always possible. This philosophy, which Knudsen and the American automotive industry brought to military production, proved decisive because modern war is fundamentally about industrial capacity and logistics, not about individual weapon performance. The cultural impact of the Sherman extended into the Cold War and beyond, shaping American military procurement and industrial mobilization planning in ways that are still visible today. The success of rapid mass production during World War II created expectations that American industry could quickly convert to war production if needed, an assumption that influenced Cold War strategies and led to reduced standing armies in favor of industrial capacity that could expand if war came. The Sherman also became a symbol in the broader American cultural narrative about World War II. The humble, reliable workhorse that wasn't glamorous or technically sophisticated, but got the job done through determination and industrial might, a mechanical embodiment of American values that prioritized practicality over perfectionism. This narrative sometimes obscured the human costs. Thousands of American tankers died in Shermans, burned to death or killed by penetrating shots that the tank's armor couldn't stop. But it also captured something true about how America approaches problems, with an emphasis on scalability, reliability, and pragmatic solutions over elegant but fragile perfection. The Sherman's influence on subsequent American armor design was profound. The M26 Pershing, M46 Patton, and M48 Patton tanks that followed incorporated lessons learned from Sherman combat experience, particularly the need for heavier armor and bigger guns, but they also retained the Sherman's emphasis on reliability, ease of maintenance, and mechanical simplicity that allowed wide deployment and sustained operations. William Knudsen never sought public recognition for his role in creating the Sherman or in transforming American industry into the arsenal of democracy. He returned to private life after the war, rejoining General Motors and dying in 1948 at age 68, having lived long enough to see the Sherman vindicated by victory, but not long enough to witness the historical debates about whether it was the right tank or simply the right tank for America's circumstances. His legacy lies not in any single weapon, but in the demonstration that industrial capacity, properly mobilized and directed, could be as decisive as any military innovation, that wars between industrial powers are ultimately won by logistics and production, rather than by individual weapon superiority, and that simplicity and reliability, while less glamorous than technical sophistication, often matter more when measured across millions of parts, thousands of vehicles, and years of sustained combat operations. The men who designed, built, and crewed the Sherman transformed American automotive expertise into military power in ways that reshaped global conflict and established patterns that persist in American military procurement to this day. The Sherman story challenges comfortable narratives about technological progress and military effectiveness by demonstrating that more advanced isn't always better, that the best solution depends entirely on the problem you're trying to solve, and that in a global war requiring coordination across oceans and continents, a simple, reliable tank you can build by the tens of thousands matters more than a technically superior tank you can only build by the thousands. The German crews who laughed at American tanks in 1942 learned this lesson by 1944, when they found themselves fighting against seemingly endless waves of Shermans supported by fighter bombers, artillery, and logistics networks that kept them supplied and mobile, while German armor starved for fuel and spare parts. The psychological impact of facing an enemy who could replace losses faster than you could inflict them, who could maintain operational tempo while your own units ground to a halt from mechanical failures, and who demonstrated through sheer volume that technical superiority meant nothing if you couldn't field enough vehicles to contest the battlefield. This impact was perhaps the Sherman's greatest weapon, the demonstration that American industrial power could bury German military skill under a tidal wave of adequate but unstoppable production. So what do we take from the story of the Sherman tank, the machine that German crews dismissed as inferior until it proved them deadly wrong? First, that effectiveness in war isn't about individual technical superiority, but about system-level integration of production, logistics, training, and tactical employment into a coherent whole. Second, that simple and reliable often beats complex and sophisticated when measured across the scale and duration that global wars require, because mechanical failures and supply disruptions affect outcomes as much as combat performance. Third, that human factors, crew training, morale, determination, and the knowledge that losses can be replaced, matter as much as armor thickness and gun caliber, and that armies that can sustain combat power through replacement and repair ultimately prevail over those that can't. The Sherman wasn't the best tank of World War II by most technical measures, but it was the right tank for America's strategic circumstances, the perfect expression of industrial philosophy applied to military requirements, and the vehicle that carried American and Allied forces to victory, not through individual superiority, but through relentless, unstoppable volume that German industry simply couldn't match. The men who built it understood that winning a global war required thinking differently than traditional military planning suggested, that automobiles and tanks shared more DNA than most generals realized, and that the same principles that made Ford Model Ts affordable for millions could make Sherman tanks available for armies fighting across 3 continents. As we close this chapter of World War II history, think about the broader lessons that extend beyond tanks and battles into how we approach any large-scale challenge requiring coordination of complex systems across time and distance. The Sherman's success wasn't about having the best individual component, but about integrating good enough components into a system that worked reliably, could be maintained by people with basic training, and could be produced at scale sufficient to meet strategic requirements. These principles apply to modern challenges as diverse as pandemic response, infrastructure development, and technological deployment. Sometimes simple and scalable beats sophisticated and fragile. Sometimes good enough deployed widely beats perfect deployed rarely. And sometimes the humble workhorse that keeps running matters more than the thoroughbred that wins individual races but breaks down under sustained stress. Drop a comment below sharing any family stories about relatives who served in tank crews, who worked in war production factories, or who experienced the transformation of American industry during World War II. Let's build a community that understands that military history isn't just about battles and weapons, but about industrial systems, human determination, and the complex relationships between technology, strategy, and logistics that determine outcomes when nations commit everything to total war. If this story changed how you think about the Sherman tank or about the relationship between technical sophistication and strategic effectiveness, hit that like button to help others discover that history is more nuanced and interesting than simple narratives of good weapons versus bad weapons. Subscribe to this channel for more psychological and cultural perspectives on World War II technology, stories that explore how engineering decisions shaped battlefield outcomes and how industrial philosophy influenced strategic results in ways that traditional military history often overlooks. Click the notification bell for our next video examining how Britain's supposedly inferior radar system actually outperformed Germany's more sophisticated technology, because reliability and operator training mattered more than technical specifications. Another story of how wars are won by systems rather than individual superiority. Until then, remember that the Sherman tank won the war not by being invincible, but by being unstoppable, not through perfection, but through persistence, and not because German crews were wrong to laugh at its specifications, but because they failed to understand that in a global industrial war, the tank that can be everywhere matters more than the tank that can beat anything. That's the history worth preserving, the history that teaches us how determined people with adequate tools and unlimited determination can overcome opponents with superior weapons, but limited capacity. Thank you for watching, and never forget that sometimes the best solution isn't the most advanced. It's the one you can actually build, deploy, maintain, and replace at the scale and pace that victory requires. The Sherman story doesn't end with victory in Europe and the Pacific. It continues through decades of post-war service that demonstrated just how right the American design philosophy had been. how a tank built for one war became the foundation for armor doctrine that shaped the next 50 years of mechanized warfare. When World War II ended in August 1945, thousands of Shermans remained in service with American forces occupying Germany and Japan. And rather than scrapping this massive investment, the U.S. government transferred Shermans to Allied nations, rebuilding their militaries in the emerging Cold War confrontation with the Soviet Union. Israel received Shermans and modified them extensively, upgrading the guns to French 75mm and later 105mm weapons that transformed the tank from a 1940s design into a vehicle capable of fighting Soviet-supplied Arab armor in the 1950s and 1960s. Israeli tank crews facing T-34s and T-54s in the 1956 Suez Crisis and 1967 Six-Day War discovered what American crews had learned 20 years earlier, that crew training, tactical employment, and maintenance discipline mattered more than raw specifications, and that a well-handled Sherman could defeat supposedly superior opponents through superior gunnery, better situational awareness, and aggressive maneuvering that exploited the enemy's weaknesses rather than engaging in frontal duels that favored heavier armor. The French used Shermans in Indochina during the 1950s, where the tank's mechanical reliability proved decisive in jungle environments where more sophisticated vehicles would have broken down, and where the ability to keep armor operational with minimal spare parts and field-expedient repairs meant the difference between maintaining mobility and becoming static targets for Viet Minh ambushes. British and Commonwealth forces used Shermans in Malaya, fighting communist insurgents, in Korea supporting infantry operations against Chinese and North Korean forces, and in various colonial conflicts where the tank's versatility, its ability to serve as infantry support, mobile artillery, or breakthrough weapon depending on tactical requirements, made it more valuable than specialized vehicles that excelled in one role but couldn't adapt to others. The Sherman's service life extended into the 1970s in some armies, a testament to the fundamental soundness of its design, and to the reality that most armored warfare doesn't involve dueling with enemy heavy tanks, but rather requires reliable mobile firepower that can be maintained under difficult conditions and employed flexibly across varied terrain and tactical situations. This longevity validated everything William Knudsen and the American automotive engineers had believed about prioritizing simplicity and reliability over technical sophistication, about building weapons that crews with average skills could operate effectively, rather than machines that required specialist training, and about designing for the full life cycle of military equipment including maintenance, repair, and eventual replacement, rather than just initial combat performance. The human stories of Sherman crews provide texture that pure technical analysis misses, revealing how men formed bonds with their machines that transcended rational assessment of capabilities and limitations. Tank crews named their Shermans, painted nose art on the hulls, and developed superstitions about which vehicles were lucky and which were cursed, creating psychological relationships with steel and machinery that helped them cope with the terror of fighting inside metal boxes that could become crematoriums if hit in the wrong place. Sergeant Lafayette Poole, who survived having 3 Shermans destroyed under him and who commanded a 4th that achieved legendary kill counts, described his relationship with his final Sherman, nicknamed In the Mood, in terms that revealed both pragmatism and affection. She wasn't the best tank ever built, but she was my tank, and she got me home every night that mattered. We knew her quirks, the way the transmission would grind if you shifted too fast, the way the turret traverse would stick in cold weather until you worked it warm, the exact sweet spot where the gun was zeroed. That knowledge kept us alive because we weren't fighting with a machine. We were fighting with a partner we understood completely. This intimate familiarity that came from operating the same vehicle repeatedly was possible only because Sherman reliability meant crews could expect to keep the same tank for extended periods rather than constantly switching to replacement vehicles, and because Sherman mechanical simplicity meant that crews could perform their own maintenance and repairs, developing expertise that made them more effective than crews who depended entirely on specialist mechanics. The cultural mythology that developed around the Sherman in American popular memory reflects broader tensions about how we remember World War II and what narratives we construct about American military power. Hollywood films and television shows from the 1950s through the 1980s often portrayed the Sherman as inadequate, emphasizing the tank's vulnerability to German heavy armor and creating a narrative where American tankers were brave but poorly equipped. winning through determination rather than material superiority. This narrative, while containing elements of truth about specific engagements where Shermans faced Tigers or Panthers, obscured the broader reality that German heavy tanks were rare, that most German armor the Sherman faced was comparable or inferior, and that American victory came from exactly the kind of industrial and logistical superiority that the Sherman represented. The persistence of the death trap narrative served several cultural functions. It allowed Americans to remember the war as a morally clear victory without confronting the uncomfortable reality that victory came partly from overwhelming material advantage rather than just righteousness. It provided a way to honor tanker sacrifice by emphasizing their courage in facing superior equipment, and it fit within Cold War anxieties about whether American industrial might could match Soviet numerical superiority in a future conflict. Military historians spent decades pushing back against this mythology, using combat reports, loss statistics, and comparative analysis to demonstrate that the Sherman was actually a highly effective weapon system whose perceived weaknesses were largely artifacts of selective memory and German propaganda that survived the war. The technical evolution of the Sherman during the war years demonstrated American engineering pragmatism and the advantages of a standardized platform that could be continuously improved without disrupting production. The original M4 with its cast hull and radial aircraft engine gave way to multiple variants. The M4A1 with welded hull, the M4A2 with diesel engines primarily used by Soviet and British forces, the M4A3 with Ford GAA V8 engine that became the preferred U.S. Army version, and the M4A4 with Chrysler multibank engine used primarily by British forces. Each variant shared enough components that spare parts logistics remained manageable, but each also incorporated improvements based on combat feedback and manufacturing considerations. The most significant evolution was the transition from the original 75mm gun to the high-velocity 76mm gun starting in mid-1944, providing Sherman crews with a weapon capable of penetrating German heavy armor at reasonable combat ranges and finally giving them parity with Panther tanks in firepower, if not in armor protection. The British developed the Sherman Firefly, mounting their 17-pounder anti-tank gun in a Sherman chassis, creating a vehicle that could reliably kill Tigers and Panthers, but was produced in limited numbers due to manufacturing complexity. These variants demonstrated the wisdom of the original design philosophy. By creating a standardized platform with modular components, American engineers enabled rapid evolution and specialization without fragmenting logistics or requiring complete redesigns that would have disrupted production and complicated maintenance. The Sherman's influence on post-war American military doctrine extended beyond tank design to shape broader thinking about military procurement, industrial mobilization, and the relationship between technical sophistication and strategic effectiveness. The success of mass production during World War II created expectations that would later prove problematic. Planners assumed that if war came, American industry could quickly ramp up production of standardized weapons in quantities sufficient to overwhelm any opponent, an assumption that worked in World War II because the war's duration gave time for mobilization, but that proved less applicable in limited wars like Korea and Vietnam, where political constraints prevented full industrial mobilization. The Sherman experience also reinforced American preference for multi-role platforms over specialized vehicles, leading to Cold War armor development that emphasized versatility and sustainability over narrow optimization for specific threats. The M48 and M60 Patton tanks, and eventually the M1 Abrams, all reflected lessons learned from Sherman experience: the importance of mechanical reliability, the value of standardization for logistics and maintenance, the need for a balance between protection and mobility rather than maximum armor at the expense of speed, and the recognition that crew survivability depended not just on armor thickness, but on ergonomics, escape hatches, fire suppression systems, and ammunition storage that minimized catastrophic secondary explosions. The question of whether the Sherman was a good tank or merely an adequate tank, produced in overwhelming numbers, remains contentious among military historians and armor enthusiasts. But this debate often obscures the more important question: what does good mean in the context of global industrial warfare? If good means winning individual tank versus tank duels, then the Sherman was inferior to German heavy armor and roughly equivalent to medium tanks like the Panzer IV and Panther. If good means accomplishing strategic objectives at acceptable cost, then the Sherman was arguably the best tank of the war, because it enabled Allied victory in multiple theaters, while being produced in numbers that made battlefield losses sustainable, and employed in ways that exploited its strengths rather than exposing its weaknesses. The Sherman's legacy ultimately rests not on its technical specifications, but on its role in demonstrating that modern war between industrial powers is fundamentally about systems integration, about creating feedback loops between battlefield experience and production improvement, about logistics networks that can sustain operations across oceans and continents, and about industrial capacity that can replace losses faster than the enemy can inflict them. These lessons, learned at terrible cost by the men who fought and died in Shermans, shaped American military thinking for generations and established principles that remain relevant in contemporary discussions about military procurement, force structure, and the relationship between technical sophistication and strategic effectiveness. The final accounting of the Sherman's impact must include not just tanks destroyed and battles won, but also the lives saved by American industrial power ending the war faster than would have been possible with smaller, slower production of technically superior vehicles. Every month the war continued cost tens of thousands of lives in combat, in concentration camps, in bombed cities, and in occupied territories where Nazi brutality continued unchecked. The Sherman's availability and overwhelming numbers enabled offensives in 1944 and 1945 that might have been impossible or delayed by years if American industry had prioritized technical perfection over rapid production, if engineers had insisted on matching German armor and firepower specifications before approving the design for manufacture, if the military had demanded specialized vehicles for each tactical situation, rather than accepting a versatile platform that was good enough for most situations. The veterans who survived the war because American armor was available when and where it was needed. The civilians who were liberated months or years earlier than they would have been with smaller Allied armored forces. The concentration camp prisoners who survived because liberation came before disease or murder claimed them. These uncountable lives represent the Sherman's truest legacy, the proof that William Knudsen and the automotive engineers who transformed American industry were right to prioritize availability over perfection, that wars are won not by the best individual weapons but by systems that can project power sustainably across time and space, and that sometimes good enough delivered in overwhelming quantity saves more lives than perfect delivered too late or in too few numbers. The Sherman tank won the war not by being invincible, but by being inevitable, not through technical superiority, but through industrial supremacy, and not because German mockery was factually wrong, but because they were mocking the wrong metrics, focusing on specifications that mattered in individual engagements while missing the systemic advantages that would ultimately bury them under a tidal wave of American production that they simply could not match or counter.